All right, as promised, we take you right back to the virtual memorial service in honor of legend Jonas Gwangwa.
R&B. These had come to dominate the popular idiom. And the American musicians were saying to the African musicians, you know, you guys have got something that we don't have. You've got the original sound. Instead of playing American music with an African accent, why don't you play African music with a strongly African accent? And I think that sort of confirmed Jonas and Hugh in the direction that they were going, in any case, playing their own original African songs, African music, using African musicians. Given Jonas's patriotism, it was inevitable that he would want to link his musical career to the struggle for national liberation. As an ANC youth leader from the mid-50s, he had always taken a very keen interest in the struggle of his people. In the United States, there was in the beginning, a very small number of us South African students, a few musicians, Jonas, Hugh. The great Miriam Makeba had opened the ears of American audiences to the South African sound. And South African musicians who arrived in the United States during the 1960s and after were relatively well received because there had been these earlier arrivals, Miriam in the first instance, followed by Hugh and Jonas, so that when people like Letta and Caiaphas, Abdullah Ibrahim, and others arrived, there was already a very receptive American audience, and they were able to pursue their musical careers. When he returned to the African continent in the 1970s and established himself in Botswana, this was a time when there was a reawakening culturally and politically in South Africa itself. And Jonas was able to link up with that movement, especially through the Medu arts ensemble, then led by Mongane Surute, who had just recently returned from the United States himself. There were also movements inside South Africa, which they linked up with, resulting in the mid-80s Culture and Resistance Festival, which took place in Gaborone. These were important stepping stones in a radical cultural movement, which was sweeping Southern Africa at the time. One of the jokes which went around in ANC circles and even amongst our supporters, especially after the Soweto uprising of 1976, and there was a stream of young people who came out of the country, some in search of further education, many in search of military skills so that they could go back and fight for freedom. But what was striking amongst them is that all of them wanted to be poets. And I remember the German instructors joking about it and saying, yes, with a movement with so many poets, we expect that South Africa is going to produce writings that will outclass those of Goethe and Heine and all the German poets. You've got so many poets in the ranks. Of course, not all the poets were as good as they thought they were. But Gwangwa was one of the people who helped hone the artistic and other creative capacities of the young people who came out of the country post-76. As has been mentioned, when the ANC declared 79, the centennial of the Battle of Isandlwana, the year of the spear, Jonas was recruited by the late Joe Gabi into MK, and he traveled to Angola, where he was immediately put in charge of gathering together the young talent in all the camps. And in fact, I suppose all the settlements that the ANC had in exile, we always encouraged one form or other of cultural activity. Even in an outpost like London, we had a small cultural unit using poetry and song, which we called Maibuye, which did a lot of solidarity work in Eastern Europe. But Maibuye was sort of, if you like, the opening salvo of what was to come. Because once Gwangwa began working with those young people in Angola and produced that semi-professional group called the Amandla ensemble, it put Maibuye in the shade. Amandla was different in that, in addition to poetry and song, there was music, acting, and because they were trained by someone who had skills with respect to stagecraft, it was a highly professional production. Made a big hit, of course, where it was based in Angola, and did a tour of the then frontline states, Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, but also took a number of European countries by storm. The Scandinavian countries, the USSR, German Democratic Republic, etc. Jonas's contribution was not only in terms of professionalizing Amandla, but also in discovering new talent. Many of the members of the Amandla band were personally trained by Jonas himself. Most of them, in the beginning, had mastered the guitar, the electric guitar, the bass, and conga drums. But the brass instruments, literally most of them were taught to play by Jonas Gwangwa himself. The dances as well. Jonas had been exposed to dance both in King Kong and in previous shows at home, but he'd also been exposed to modern dance, especially in the United States. And he used all that knowledge to improve the routines of Amandla. And by the time the movement was unbanned in 1990, one can say that we had a troupe that could have held its own off Broadway and in many other theatre districts throughout the world. I think what we want to remember most with respect to this comrade is his immense musical talent. It was recognized very early in his life while he was at St. Peter's College, which was why he was recruited into the Huddleston Band. And there's a music story attached to that, because Gwangwa says he originally had wanted to play the clarinet, but when the instruments were distributed for the band, he ended up with the trombone. But it seems as if it was not a mistake that he ended up with the trombone, because he mastered that instrument like no one else has done. And I would say among South African trombonists, he's probably one of the most outstanding. There are also a number of other dimensions to his life, which I think do need to be mentioned. While he was in New York, Gwangwa lived in a basement flat, which by, I suppose, chance and good fortune, sort of became a salon for South African artists, South African students, South Africans living in the United States. It was the one place you could go to any day of the week, and always you find good company for conversation, and there was always food available for us poor students. So it was a place of gathering in which we tried to recreate a South African environment as best we could. One of the more amusing attempts to do this was the smuggling in from a farm in New Jersey of a sheep which was ritually slaughtered inside Jonas's basement flat. We used the bathtub in the bathroom for that purpose. And while someone was busy and blood was running out, etc., Jonas remarked, "Hey, Muna, you know, if they are working on the drains downstairs there, if they're working on the drains, they're going to think a terrible murder is taking place." Of course, nothing like that happened. But it's one of the achievements of South Africans that we are, I think, are the few people who actually were able to slaughter ritually a sheep in the middle of Manhattan. The meal was accompanied with traditional beer and also by a brew, typically South African brew called Paina. These were some of the fun and games one can talk about we had in New York. When Gwangwa was in Angola, our paths again crossed, and we had been very, very good friends in the States, but our collaboration working for the ANC together firmed up that relationship. And I would say that by the time we went to conference in 1985, and Jonas was moving between Angola and Botswana, he survived that murderous attack by the special forces of the racist regime on Botswana in 1985, an attack which was timed also to make a point because it happened on the 15th of June 1985, and the racists knew that the ANC consultative conference was going to begin the next day, and that was the point they were trying to make a slap in the face. The comrades who fell on that day, fortunately, did not include Gwangwa, any members of his family. And it was as a result of that that they moved first to Lusaka and then subsequently to London. It was during that time that he was drawn into working on the musical score of the film Cry Freedom. And as we know, the score for that movie was nominated for an Academy Award in 1987. It didn't get it, but it's notable that it was nominated because it means that there was recognition of the immense talent that Jonas Gwangwa possessed. Coming back home took him via the Casa Culture in Another South African Music and Cultural Festival hosted by the city of Amsterdam in 1987, and also a number of other such encounters internationally. 1990 was the great turning point, of course, for all of us. And we sought to use Jonas's music, especially during the elections campaign in 1984. And as we know, music played a very, very big role in terms of galvanizing our people for that initial ANC victory. In remembering Gwangwa, one will remember, in addition to the talent, the man's commitment to his people, commitment to his country, his commitment to the struggle. And I think the musical legacy he leaves behind will outlast him. I don't share the view that musicians fade away. The names of great musicians live on long after they've departed, and they live on because of what they've left behind us. And the legacy Jonas has left us, I am certain, will live on through the ages. And as we dip our banners in saluting him, I want to say to my old friend, Lala Mokolo Fogabao, Ambakashe Kontro. Thank you.
All right, of course, that is the virtual memorial service for the legendary jazz icon Jonas Gwangwa, and former Minister of Arts and Culture Pallo Jordan, taking us on taking us back really to the life and times of the jazz legend, who actually rightly should actually be referred to as a liberation struggle hero too. I think taking us also back to Gwangwa's time in New York, and we've heard a lot about that since his recent passing and that infamous basement flat. We've heard a lot of people talking about this particular basement flat in New York that he had, and of course hearing about the attempt on his life in Botswana. A lot of memories being shared this afternoon at Jonas Gwangwa's memorial service.